Welcome to our introductory video on our governance, risk and compliance platform, the Morrisec Risk Platform. I'm breaking this video out into two distinct parts. The first part, I'm going to run through a bit around the platform and why we developed the platform, and I think that's critical in why it's beneficial to your organization and how it can actually help you. The second part, I'll go into a live demonstration on the platform so you can see it in action and see the things that we've talked about in the first part. So I guess where we start is we have this notion that security is really difficult, that information security and cybersecurity aren't that hard. We've known what the problems are for a long, long time, and we know how to fix them. So why is it that we're at the state we are in the world at the moment with the issues that we have? And a lot of this is around, while we know what to do and we know how to fix it, the issue is the resourcing and having the time for those resources to do what they need to do. So why is it we're so time poor? So when we started Morrisec, our company, we wanted to take a step back and look at what are all the things that we need to do as cybersecurity professionals to run our security strategy and the way to mature ourselves as an organization in the security space. And we wanted to do this so we could work backwards to develop our solutions instead of just going to market and selling things that we assume people need. Is how do we provide real value? So if you start looking at a security program, where we always start is information assets. We need to understand what it is we have, what we're trying to protect, what type of data is in those systems that we need to protect. And then it also leads into running business impact assessments and understanding the impact to the business if that asset is down, if it's compromised. This leads into other areas such as cyber resilience. And then once we've identified everything, we start looking at what are the risks. So we start running risk assessments across those assets and across our data. And that allows us to understand what we need to protect against. And out of that comes a whole bunch of findings and remediation tasks. And when we talk about addressing risk, we talk about implementing controls. And controls can be, governance, administrative controls, they can be technical controls, and they can also be physical controls. So we start implementing these controls, and then we start to need to look at controls assurance. And that looks at the controls that we've implemented. Are they actually doing what we want them to do? Are they effective? Are they actually reducing risk? And this is where you start looking at penetration tests, audits, risk assessments, and come out with a whole bunch more findings and a whole bunch more remediation tasks that need to be managed. And then we start looking at supplier management as well, because supplier risk is huge at the moment. And if you're doing any sort of compliance requirements, third-party risk is built into it. And that brings on a whole new scope that we need to manage. At this point, we're managing a lot. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of cross-referenced information. And then we bring compliance into it. And there's a lot of compliance standards out there now that people have to comply against, whether it's you're certifying the ISO 27001, whether you're working with government and have to do Essential 8 or ISM, financial services with CPS 234. We have lots of privacy requirements around GDPR or Australian privacy principles, and a whole swather of other ones. And then on top of all of this, even if we're managing this well, we still have ongoing business as usual tasks. We're talking about policy reviews and user access reviews and developing reports for our executives and board so they know the state of security. And it's even more that we have to manage. And then across all of these tasks is how are they tied to roles and responsibilities? Because all these different tasks we have are generally distributed across the business at different points, especially with different owners of different parts of information. And this only touches on the surface. Like we've got this diagram here, but it's missing a lot of things. We're not talking about vulnerability management. We're not talking about exception management. We're not talking about third-party contracts. There's a whole lot of other things. And the problem is, how do we manage all this with a finite amount of time? We really need to make every second count. We don't want to be wasting time on mundane tasks or tasks that don't provide value. So we sat there and we said, how are we going to provide real value for our clients? So we started to draw up a list of outcomes that we needed or what we wanted to achieve. First thing is we wanted to replace spreadsheets. Everyone uses spreadsheets for management, and it's really difficult to manage 20 plus spreadsheets. We wanted to cross-link data because data separately in a separate spreadsheet isn't hugely useful. You want to be able to tie things like your assets and your risks and your controls all together so you know how they work together. And we wanted visibility in reporting. In a spreadsheet, we don't have great visibility. It's a bunch of text unless you start putting in graphs and managing that. And we wanted to reduce the time in developing reports. We wanted a way to manage tasks as well. So everyone has a lot of tasks to manage, and business as usual tasks take priority, and we just forget about the tasks that need to be done on a daily or a monthly or a quarterly basis just to make sure we stay secure. So we wanted a way to automate and streamline our processes as well, so we didn't forget about these tasks. And so we could automate tasks that didn't provide a huge amount of value, so we could focus on more important tasks. We wanted a way to create artifacts and retain those artifacts for audits, because you can spend a lot of time preparing for and during those audits in just getting artifacts together and all that information and running through all that information with the auditor. So we wanted to reduce audit impact, and this leads into reducing the overall cost of compliance. So we needed a GRC platform. We've known this in past roles for years. It's something we need if we really want to manage things. As in the past, we'd gone out and we looked at what platforms were out there that could be used to help our clients, and there's a lot of problems. They didn't provide the functionality we needed. They were aimed at banks and big enterprises, which means they cost a lot of money. So it's not feasible for small to medium-sized businesses, which is a lot of the clients that we deal with. They were very US-centric and lacked Australian standards. So they didn't have things like our APPs in there. They don't necessarily have CPS 234. A lot of them comes with no standards, and you've got to put the standards in yourself, which is a lot of work. Others are too complex and they require multiple people to manage them, which just increases the overall cost. And a big one is they're not designed by security professionals. When you look at a lot of GRC platforms out there, it's a software company that's gone and seen a gap in the marketplace and gone, let's develop a GRC platform. They may have had input from some security professionals, but a lot of the time they don't do what we need to do. So we looked at what if we developed our own platform? And to be honest, when you work in security and risk management, it can really suck because you see risks everywhere you go. So we started seeing the risks in developing a platform. We looked at a couple of options. The first was doing a SaaS platform. And the problem with that is the thought of holding hundreds or thousands of clients' information in a single platform just becomes a target for threat actors. If they can compromise that system, they can get access to so much information with those clients. Basically, we did not want the responsibility of holding other people's information. We don't want to become another one of those breach statistics. So we were thinking, what if we had a self-hosted platform? So developing something that can be run up on your own infrastructure as a standard application, in Windows or Linux or whatever. And then that didn't really tie in with the business model what we wanted around it, because as I mentioned before, we work a lot with SMBs, and them having to manage even more systems and secure systems and pen test those systems and do all those things around it just adds to that total cost. We wanted to make sure that whatever we did, wherever that data was held, it was going to tie into our clients' data sovereignty requirements. Now, we're Australian based, and that's great for our Australian clients, but if we're building a platform that's going to go international as well, it needs to work across all those different regions, across EU, across US. It came down to one place that we thought was ideal, and that was around Microsoft's Power Platform. And there's quite a few reasons for that. So firstly, it gives you access to Power Apps, which is a great platform for developing an actual application that can be used. And it also gives you Power Automate, which would support our need and requirements around automation. The other piece is it sits within your own tenancy. So if you're locked down to an Australian region, Australian data centers in Microsoft, all of your data is going to stay there. And it's going to be inside your tenancy and locked down to your access control rules. So we aren't managing it for you. You're managing your own data. It's never leaving that environment. The other piece is everyone's licensed for Power Platform. If you've got any sort of business plan, you get access to Power Platform. So it's nice and easy without additional licensing. You have Microsoft's built-in security around access controls, groups, and multi-factor authentication, all those great things that they've spent billions developing. It's web-based, it's mobile-ready, and it's simple and secure by default. And what I mean by that is it sits in your environment. It's not one of those platforms that's easy to accidentally give access to the internet. You have to go through multiple stages to give users access to that system. So the Morrisec Risk Platform was born, or MRP, or Mr. P as we like to call him. The last bit I want to talk about before I get into what's actually in the platform is what actually makes this different. I talked about this briefly before about the problem with other GRC platforms, but why make another one? And why would you want to choose this over what's already out in the marketplace? And it comes down to what I like to say is our intent and our design behind it. And what I mean by intent is we developed this platform to support our managed services because that's predominantly what Morrisec does. And we wanted a way to make sure that those managed services that we delivered to our clients were providing real value and we weren't wasting time doing mundane tasks that don't provide little value. So it's not our business strategy. We didn't go, there's a gap in the marketplace. We're going to go out there, develop software and be a software company. It's still only a small component of our business strategy. We built it to support our managed services so we could deliver better outcomes to our clients. Now, you can use Mr. P within our managed services or you can use it outside because we've had a lot of requests to have it just as software. And I'll talk about this at the end. We built it to reduce time and reduce wasted effort on mundane tasks. It's there to get rid of those tasks and allow us to focus time on those big ticket items. And those sort of things within our clients are performing risk assessments, doing incident response tabletops, doing awareness training, doing all sorts of other high value tasks. And the other piece is around design. It was designed by CISOs, consultants, and people who have worked in security for years. The founders of Morrisec both have 25 years experience in information security and cybersecurity. So we've worked in CISO roles, we've worked in risk management roles, we've worked as penetration testers, as developers, as technical consultants, as GRC consultants. We've done everything. So we've taken all of that knowledge and experience on the consulting side and also working on the client side, implementing and doing all these tasks and put it into this platform. We've been there, we know what it's like to do this stuff. The design's there to provide value. It's not there to tick boxes. Yes, it ticks boxes for compliance requirements, but it's there to give you visibility and allow you to progress your security maturity over time. It was designed to support audits and reduce that massive impact that more and more people are seeing on a day-to-day basis because of the ongoing security compliance requirements across various industries. And most of all, while it can be used for large enterprises, it was designed to support small to medium-sized businesses. So it's there to be simplified and easy to use and cost-effective as well. So from the start, we had a few initial focus areas, and they're around basically what I talked about in that complexity diagram before. Information asset management, risk management, control testing, audit and assessment management, and I'll get into this a bit later because this is a difficult place for people to manage a lot of those external audits and compliance assessments. Third-party supply management is a massive one as well. Also helps you manage tasks, and I'll drill into the task management component, which we really, really love and our clients love. It allows you to tie roles and responsibilities across every single aspect of your program and every single little piece of data. It provides automation through Power Automate to speed up and get rid of a lot of those tasks that people just waste a lot of time on. And it gives you visibility through dashboards and charts and also ability to export reports. So talking through each component, and as I go through one, I'll do a demonstration and show what they're like, is the first component is around information assets. And this replaces your information asset register. It allows you to track asset owners and custodians and tie it to those people, which then allows you to do automations which involve those people. It allows you to track your confidentiality, integrity, and availability, your data classifications, data sovereignties, RTOs, RPOs, a lot of important information. And everything in MRP is customizable. So if there's fields relevant to you and data you want to store within that asset record, you can add those within a couple of seconds. It's really, really easy. It tracks data types. So are you storing PII, financial information, IP, all that different stuff. And these are a lot of information you don't usually get in a normal asset register. Tracks supplier management and supplier access, so you know who has access to those critical systems and who has access to that data. Associated risks that are tied to those assets, so have you identified any risks that impact those assets, and then what are the controls that are going to be implemented for those assets. And this helps you ensure that when you're doing control testing that certain controls have been applied to certain assets that must have those controls in place. And then it allows you to run business impact assessments as well. And this is where I have another video around this coming out shortly. And this streamlines that process so much and provides so much value. And here you have the asset management page. So all the entities you see on the left-hand side allow you to access different components within MRP. So each of them starts with what we call a view, and this is the view of your actual asset register. And these views are fully configurable. So if I go to the edit columns view, I can actually add any columns that are within the different asset register records. So depending on what you need to do, you can customize this. We also have filters, which allow us to filter this by different types of data so we can see specific information that we need. And on all of these view screens, you have this drop down, which allows you to look at different views, which are really just customized views based on filters. So here I can see all my active assets. If I wanted to have a look at what decommissioned assets I have, I can see that I used to have Microsoft Power BI and it was decommissioned on the 31st of January. So I've got historical information for everything within my asset register. And then other specific views like my PCI DSS in scope assets if you're a PCI DSS compliant company. So tracking this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the records in a minute. So I can drill down into any of these records and I've got the information I talked about previously. I've got information around the name, the description. I've got my asset owners and asset custodians, and all of these are linked to roles and responsibilities within the system. So I can go in here and I can have a look at the Chief Compliance Officer here, information they're an employee. You can also track people that have access to outside your organization. So turning this on, I now can track what company they're part of. And you can also track relevant information like their bio, what's their experience, what certifications they have. And this is critical for things like CPS 234, where you're supposed to keep track of people's experience to make sure that they're actually qualified to do the different security tasks that they've been assigned. Going back to my record, this one links to a third-party supplier, so I can drill straight in and have a look at this third-party supplier, which is Microsoft, and I've got all this information, which I'll look at the supplier management piece later. I've got an active asset here, and if I want to, like we saw before, I can decommission this and I can put in a decommissioning date and decommissioning notes. So it allows me to keep track of that for auditing purposes. I can track type of infrastructure. I can track the type of authentication on the system, so I can see potential weaknesses where we're not using MFA, maybe we're just using passwords. We can track the data sovereignty, so we can specify exactly different regions or different countries where data might be stored on this asset. We've got a flag for personal data, so we can divide out any specific assets that have access to PII. This is the PCI DSS in scope flag, which I showed before. So we can actually, if you're doing PCI DSS, you can switch this on and instantly you're tracking your asset register just for PCI DSS. So there's no extra overhead of having a second asset register. I can track whether it's a key asset. So you might be thinking, what's a key asset? Everything in MRP, you can mouse over and it gives you information about what this is. So a key asset refers to an asset the business would have difficulty operating without, even for a short period of time. So there's lots of information in here as well. I can track data types as well. So this contains employee data and operational data, but I can select different types. And again, everything is configurable. So if you have different data types which are not listed down here, you can add them in. You've got your CAA ratings. So you can select on these. Again, these are configurable based on what levels of confidentiality, integrity, and availability you've defined. And same with data classification levels. We've got the defaults in here, which we use for most clients, the 4 levels, but you can change these and change the colors and whatever you need to fit in with your business. We can track RTOs and RPOs as well. So we've got information for our DR and BCP plans. Moving on to the next piece, we have risks. So we can see straight away what our last risk assessment date is. And this is automatically calculated from the last risk assessment we did here. And we'll talk about the assessment area later, but we can track our risk assessment straight in here. And if there's any related risks to this asset, we can see that there's a couple here. One's being closed, one's being remediated. I can drill in and see straight away and get this information. And I'll talk more about risks shortly. Moving on to our controls, we can track all related controls that should be applied to this asset. So this is great when we're doing controls testing, because we can go through and we can have a look at specific controls and what assets should have those controls implemented. We also have this recommended controls field, which a few of our clients asked for. And you can use this or you can hide it, but based on different classifications, your CA ratings and the data types, we've automatically calculated specific controls that we recommend to have in place for those types of assets. So you can choose to do these, and you can also put control applicability information in here, because if you don't want to do one of these controls, you can put it down here and document why you're not doing it. Next, we have the business impact assessment part. Again, calculates when the last BAA date was and when the next BAA date is based on your frequency, which you can select what the frequency is. And then within the business impact assessments, we can actually run business impact assessments in here. Who was interviewed. We've got full business impact assessment questionnaires that you can run through with those asset owners. And I've got another video coming out on the BAA process because it's actually quite interesting and streamlines. Next, we've got user access. So we can track user access reviews as well and keep track of when the last user access reviews were. And this is great for keeping your auditing. And then we have a notes section. So within all the different entities, we allow adding notes there, and these can be added just for various bits of information. We're always finding that as we're doing tasks and other things, there's information that we need to track and no real place to store that information. So this gives you the ability to store notes against our assets, against our risks, against our controls and other entities within MRP. And also, as you're working through MRP, if you have any questions about certain fields and certain screens, we have full built-in help on everything, and it runs through, and these are all linked in to give you information on different components of each of the records, so it's easy to understand. Next piece is around risk management. And again, like the asset register, this replaces your risk register and allows you to store all that relevant information that you would usually have in a risk register, like your severity and impact ratings, your likelihoods, the risk types. You can tie it to risk owners and what their response is to the risk. So you've got that management response, and then ties into your mitigation strategies for that risk and who owns that mitigation strategy. What are the expected timelines in remediating this risk? And then what controls are going to be implemented that are going to fix this risk. There's also the ability to cross-reference and link these risks to your assets. You don't generally get this type of information when you start using spreadsheets, and being able to tie a risk to an asset, you can look at the criticality of that asset to the business. And if it's a really, really important asset, that risk is elevated because it's more of a risk to the business. If it was a very low value asset, then that risk is not going to be as high. So it helps you adjust those risks. And it also allows you to store and link various artifacts. Like generally most people do risk reviews on a quarterly basis. It allows you to actually document those risk reviews and have all that information all ready for auditing. And here I have my risk register. So As we talked about before, this replaces your risk register and gives you all the information that you would usually have and a lot more. So in this main view, I can see my open risks, those risks that are currently being actioned or remediated. But in the different views, I can go in and I can see any closed risks. So I've got that historical information again. So I can always go back and view what's going on. And then other filtered views like open supplier risks. So if I mark certain risks as third-party risks, they then go into this. So you're not managing multiple risk registers. So this risk still exists within the open risk because it has all of our risks, but you can divide things down. So if I drill into one of these risks, all your relevant information that you'd usually have, so information around what the risk is, a description, you've got your likelihood and your impact ratings, and again, these are all configurable based on your risk matrix. So you can go in and select these, and then your risk severity is, of course, calculated from these. And that calculation, again, is adjustable based on your risk appetite. We have a risk category here, so all risks are lumped into a category, and one of the reasons for this is we can then start to see where there's potential issues across the business. So as I can see, this one's around secure data management. If I drill into it, it gives me what this risk category is about. I can see any risks that are in here, so I can see currently there's 4 risks around secure data management. I can see the control objectives that this risk category is trying to solve. I can keep notes in here like anything else. So risk categories are great for being able to see potential issues across the business. So if I go to my risk dashboard, over here on the side, I can see my risks by risk category. So you can start to see potential systemic issues across the business. So I can see the highest amount of risks I have are actually around ICT administrative policies and procedures, and then other ones around secure data management. So they're potentially areas of the business I need to focus on. So if I go back to my risk, I've got other information around the risk owner, what the risk response is, which are your standard responses, whether you're going to mitigate it, transfer it, accept it. I've got my risk status, and you can see that this is locked out because this is actually calculated based on the remediation tasks, which we'll look at in a second. I've got when the risk was created, the remediation due date when I want it to be fixed, completion date gets marked later when it's actually completed. Remediation status is in progress, and a planned remediation date is the 8th of March. So the reason that this is the 8th of March is if I look at my remediation here, I have a remediation task in here which is scheduled to be completed on the 8th of March and is in progress, which is how these fields are automatically calculated. So you don't have to do a lot of calculations and a lot of working out. The other thing to note here, which is a bit different, and this is the same for any records that are basically task-based and something that we need to do over time, is you'll see they're workflowed. So you can see that all risks have 4 different stages. We have a risk identification, we have assessment of risk where we're looking at the risk and deciding what we're going to do. We have risk treatment, and then we have closure when it's completed, and when we close it, it goes into that closed view. So it's always there. You can always reopen any of these workflows and work on them again. So if you found that this risk, after we closed it, suddenly came back because we had some findings from a report, we can actually reopen it and manage it again. So going back to the remediation task, we can put in the overarching what we're going to do for our remediation. We can tie it to a remediation owner. We have the completion date when it's done, and we can track residual likelihood impact and risk severity as well. And as I talked about before, remediation tasks, we can have multiple remediation tasks. And within this remediation task, we can have different information, we have different remediators, we can have different due dates. And again, these are workflowed. And these can be tied to risks. I mentioned before you could tie a remediation to multiple risks or multiple findings, so you're not duplicating, and this is where you can do that. If I move on to the controls tab, I then have related controls. So these are the controls that need to be implemented to satisfy and reduce this risk. So we've got 3 controls in here, and at any point I can drill in and look at these controls. There's also the ability to link findings. So what we find is often you'll have an overarching risk, but then there will be findings that impact that risk that will be found within a penetration test or an internal audit or some type of assessment. So you can link these findings back to this risk as well. And again, reduces duplication because you know you're already managing these risks, and by managing the risk, you're managing those findings. We can also tie to impacted assets, so we can see that this actual risk is impacting 3 of our assets, and we can, drill in and have a look at, criticality of these and their classifications and things like that. So we can see whether the impacted assets are actually elevating these risks. And we can also track updates. So most people do quarterly risk reviews, and we can actually keep track of those reviews in here, any relevant information, and we've got all of that for auditing. If I go back to the dashboards, I've got information here, and these are fully customizable. I can see what sort of open risks there are by their category. I can see my risk responses. I can see risk status. Any information that we have within the risk area of MRP can be embedded in these dashboards. So you can customize them based on your requirements and your needs. And of course, there's other dashboards for other areas, which we'll talk about as we go through. Control management and the control library that comes as part of MRP is critical for pretty much everything across the platform, especially when you're looking at compliance and multiple compliance standards. Each control record allows you to track things like the control owner and the control operator, what the frequency and type of the control is. There's also information around how to implement that control. Storing this type of information is critical for certain compliance standards like CPS 234, where you need to have information around how you implement a control. And the other piece is it also has how to test that control, which is another requirement of CPS 234 and other standards. So how are you going to test that control? What are the steps you're going to actually go through to make sure that control is actually effective? There's automations and BAU tasks built in, such as policy reviews. So if you've got a control, which is a governance control, specifically a policy, it will tie to policy reviews, and they're automated and sent out to policy owners to be performed on whatever frequency is set within the control. Also, any compliance requirements for those controls are also cross-linked. And being able to test control effectiveness, you can actually map your control tests to this, so you've got a record of that. All of this has some back-end automations that allow calculations to see that if a control is deemed ineffective, and therefore if it's tied into compliance standards, those pieces of your compliance standards are no longer effective and you're non-compliant. And I'll talk about a bit more in a sec. And here we have our controls library, and this allows us access to all the different controls that are built into MRP and the controls that are tied to various compliance standards. Again, we have drop downs so we can see any relevant information. So I can see the controls that we have in the control library. I can have a look and see what controls we have actually implemented out of those controls. And because policies are also an administrative or governance control, we actually have a breakout where you can actually see what policies you have in place, what are planned, when the next review dates and things like that are. So drilling down and having a look at the controls, let's take the acceptable use policy as an example. We've got all the normal information you'd have for a control. We've got the name, description, we've got a control frequency. It's a policy, so it's continuous, but if it's another control that maybe you performed on a quarterly basis, it can be marked this way. You've got who the control owners are and control operators. And like all the other records, we linked everything to roles and responsibilities, and this makes sure we've got commitment from the business, but it also allows us to perform back-end automations. We have the control type. So here we've got a governance control, we've got governance technical or physical, and under governance we've actually got some subtypes around whether it's a policy, process, procedure. And one of the reasons for this is you'll see this policy review tab here because this is a policy. If I change this to a process, that tab disappears because it's not relevant. But for policy, we need to do policy reviews, so we have an additional component in here. We can keep documentation, and at this point I haven't really talked about links within MRP. One of the design choices we made is we didn't want MRP to be another source of truth for attachments or documents or things like that. Most organizations already have document management systems, whether they're using SharePoint or Confluence or some other area to store their documentations. We didn't want data duplication, so we've included link areas within each of the records so you can link out to relevant documents. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have attachments in here. If you want to, you can add those fields, and like I said before, it's fully customizable. but our architectural design for security and reducing things like duplication was to use links. So here I've got my acceptable use policy. I've got a link here. And if I click on that link, it goes straight to that policy that I've linked there. So everything's very, very quick. And this is what speeds up the audit process. When you're going through all these different things with an auditor, being able to run through your controls and be able to click on links and have them see everything very, very quickly speeds up that process. We have the implementation status of the control. So we can mark controls as not applicable if they're not relevant to the business. We also have the ability to create alternate controls, because sometimes you might find that while there's an acceptable use policy requirement here, maybe you have your acceptable use policy within another policy. So you can link out to other controls here and you can put notes around it. So you've got this for auditing and information. Mark as planned in progress in place. So this control is currently in place and it's been marked as effective. And we'll talk about this in a second when we talk about testing. And then we've got implementation methods here. So every single control we've put in here has information around implementing it. And this is sort of best practice or what we recommend. You can change all of these to fit in with your organization. As I mentioned with a policy, you get a policy review tab. You can mark the frequency of the policy. Most people have it annually. And based on when the last review was, it would automatically calculate when the last review date is and the next review date based on your frequency. So we have automations in there that the policy owner will be notified on those dates to do a new review. And you can keep track of the reviews in a policy review record. So you've got all of this information again for the auditor. The testing tab provides us information on testing each control. So we've got built-in methodology there, so you've got information. So if you're doing things again like CPS 234, you need to keep track of how you test your controls because your auditor will want to look at that and have it documented. It's a lot of information to actually write for your controls, so we've got that all built in. Testing frequency, again, you can define when you want to test it, like how often. Again, last test date, next test date is based on frequency and your control test records here. So you can see the last test date was the 8th of November because it was tested on the 8th of November and the result was it's effective. So it's calculated effective here. And if we go back here, the control status is effective. If I had a new control test and it was marked ineffective, it would flag this control as ineffective and this would impact your actual compliance requirements around this control. And we'll talk about this in the compliance section. We have the ability to track findings. So if there's any findings that were found that impact this control in a penetration test or an audit, you can keep track of them here. Any assets, so when we looked at assets before and we had controls linked, this is back the other way. So you would see any assets that need this control implemented. And again, you can keep track of any specific notes. Everything within MRP, anything that's linked, you can actually use this related tab to see. So I can go in and see where this control sits within my other compliance standards. And we'll talk about this a bit later on. But if I wanted to see where an acceptable use policy was within ISO, I can click on here and it will tell me what relevant areas need this policy in place. And back on our dashboards, we have a control management dashboard. And this gives you some relevant information about what controls are in place, what you've got planned, are they effective, and different types of control types. And again, this is configurable based on what you need for your business and the type of information that you're trying to view. And as with all these charts, you can actually drill down into these and see relevant information. So I can click on here and see which controls are effective, and I can see which controls are currently not tested. Compliance management. This is where we have various compliance standards and out of the box today, what I'm going to call in this video, we have ASD's Essential 8, we have APRA's CPS 234, we have ISO 27001 2022 version, and we have PCI DSS 4.0. We have a whole bunch of other ones going in there at the moment, such as NIST CSF, we've got CAS Top 18 going in there, GDPR, Australian Privacy Principles, and we've got a whole bunch of other ones on the roadmap. Now, what's key to the way we manage compliance in here and why it streamlines your process is we use an assess once, comply many philosophy. And what I mean by this is What we want to do is when we have multiple compliance standards and there's overlaps between them, we don't want to be managing multiple things multiple times because it just leads to extra work, duplication, more tracking. So what we've done is we've tied overlapping controls to each compliance standard. So as an example, I always use vulnerability scanning as an example because it's a really easy one and everyone knows what it's like and it goes across every single compliance standard. So if I look at vulnerability scanning, if I look at 3 of the standards which we have in MRP, it goes across the ASD Essential 8. There's 2 mitigation strategies in there that it overlaps with. 27001 has a couple as well. And PCI DSS has 4 areas. So you've got 3 standards and 8 different compliance requirements that need to be addressed with vulnerability scanning. Now, the good thing is the way it's tied in MRP is if I have vulnerability scanning implemented, immediately I'm compliant with those 3 standards and those 8 areas, assuming there aren't any other controls in those areas. And if the same thing is if I do my control testing, I test my vulnerability scanning and I see that it's all working, I know I'm compliant with those standards. Now, going in the other direction, if I go and test my vulnerability scanning and I find I have weaknesses or it's not working properly, instantly I've got ineffectiveness within those 8 different areas and those 3 standards, and I'm no longer compliant. And this is all automatically calculated across MRP. There's nothing you need to do. If you flag as ineffective or you flag it as not implemented, it automatically calculates all of those standards in there. So there's no more duplication. When you go and do testing for vulnerability scanning, you do one test, and that one test satisfies all your different compliance standards. So starting with the compliance management dashboard, as we talked about, we've got 4 compliance standards in here at the moment. We've got ISO 27001, CPS 234 Essential 8, and PCI DSS 4.0. So I can immediately see what my compliance is across these 4 standards. And based on your organization, you can adjust this dashboard to just see those that are relevant for you. But at any time, you can turn these back on and you can see how you're complying against each of these standards. So if you suddenly had customers asking you to be ISO certified, you could go in and turn on the ISO certification dashboard and see exactly where you are. And we've got dashboards broken down for each of these areas as well. So if I want to see how I'm complying with ISO, I can see what's in place, what's in progress, what I've marked as non-applicable, and then what I've got planned, and I can see where my control effectiveness is and what my compliance status is. So at any time I can give myself basically my own gap assessment without the need of employing an external consultancy. So down the side here, we've got the different compliance standards. If I take a look at ISO, for example, in here I've got the 93 control objectives from ISO 27001 2022 Annex A. So if I look at 5.1 as an example, which is my policies of information security, I can see my implementation status is in place. I can see my control status is effective, and I can see that I'm compliant for this area of ISO. And the reason for this is all my controls are in place and have been tested and marked as effective. So to satisfy 5.1, I need an information security policy, I need an acceptable use policy, and I need an acknowledgement of information security policies by the various stakeholders across the business. As these are all in place and effective, 5.1 is in place and effective. If any of these controls weren't in place, so if I was to go in here and go to my acceptable use policy and mark it as planned, and save that record, and I go back and I can now see that it's planned and not in place. If I go here, I can now see, I've just got to save to recalculate. I can now see my implementation status is in progress. My control status is not applicable because if it's not in place, I can't actually test it, and I'm non-compliant. And the reason for that is I've got 2 controls in place and 1 planned. So all of this is automatically calculated for you. If I go back in again, and now I mark this as in place, when I go back here, I'm now in place, I'm effective, I'm compliant. For things like ISO, we also have your statement of applicability, where you can track, is this control applicable for your organization? So you can mark it as applicable or not. If it's not, I have to give a justification because that's part of ISO. Also, why I'm putting this control in place. Was it a business requirement? I can track that information. If it was a risk requirement, I can link it to the relevant risk. If it's some other compliance requirement, I can put information. So again, you've documented a lot of information in here. And for those of you doing ISO, statement of applicabilities, my statement of applicability is generated automatically on the fly anytime anything in MRP changes. So any non-compliance or any control tests or anything else that impacts it, it automatically goes into here. So we talked about the assess once, comply many, and I'm going to show you that same example that we talked about with vulnerability scanning. So if I go to my vulnerability scanning control here, I can see it's in place and I can see it's effective. Now, if I want to see where it's linked, I can go in here and go, these are the two that we talked about before that are linked to ISO. I can look at Essential 8 and it's linked to my mitigation strategies 1 and 2. And I can go into PCI DSS, which had the 4 different areas. So if I take 11.3.1 as an example, I can see it's in place, it's partially tested and it's compliant. And the reason it's partially tested is we actually haven't tested one part of it. Now, if I go into my vulnerability scanning again, and I mark this as planned, so this is no longer in place. If I then go back and look at my PCI DSS again, implementation status is automatically in progress. I'm now no longer compliant. Same thing if I go to my ISO standards and look at this, it's in progress and I'm non-compliant. And the reason for that is I don't have vulnerability scanning in place. So by doing one thing on one control, we've actually impacted all different compliance standards that control is part of. So that's the whole premise around the assess once, comply many. It reduces the need to track multiple requirements across multiple standards, and it reduces that whole duplication of work. The next piece I want to talk about is audits and assessments. So this has always been a pain point for me back when I was in CISO roles and other internal client roles, is you get a lot of different audits, you get a lot of different penetration tests, and you've got to manage those. Generally, consultancy will give you a PDF report, and then you've got to copy and paste out of it and put it into something to manage it, and it becomes very difficult. And what you find is if you're doing multiple pen tests and even audits as well, is you'll have overlapping findings that basically find the same thing and have the same remediation task. Yet you're managing, a whole bunch of different spreadsheets with overlapping requirements. So you're duplicating the work. So it allows you to import information from those various reports you receive, and you can manage them. The great thing about it is the way that we can connect different things within MRP. And what I mean by that is, if I have, say I've got 3 different penetration tests that have the same findings but on different systems, I can have one finding that's tied to those 3 different assessments, and I can have my remediation tasks tied to that to fix that one finding. So instead of having 3 findings with 3 different remediation tasks I have to manage, I've got all of those tied together. Very, very simple. So when I cross off that one remediation task, it marks all 3 findings as complete and fixed. And because it's in this system, you automatically have access to charts and dashboards to actually have visibility on where you're up to within those audits or within those pen tests. So when you get asked by senior management or the board on how you're going with the progress from that audit or from that pen test, you can actually say without trying to pull out some numbers from somewhere. The way we structure findings and remediations is findings can have an owner and remediations can be assigned to different people. And the reason for that is the remediation tasks are not necessarily performed by the person who owns the finding. And often there's multiple remediation tasks. For example, you quite often have a finding that needs to have a policy updated. You might need to also implement a technical control, and then you might need to actually train users in that new control. So you've actually got 3 remediation tasks. So within MRP, you can actually have 3 remediation tasks tied to 3 different people, and it's all connected to that one finding. So it allows you to break everything out and much more manageable and much more visibility into what's actually going on, rather than trying to track one big remediation task across multiple people. Here we have our assessments view, which allows us to track different types of external assessments. So what I'm talking about there is allows us to track things like penetration tests, risk assessments, internal or external audits, gap assessments, any type of assessment that has findings and remediations. So instead of managing PDF reports and trying to take those into spreadsheets and managing all these different spreadsheets, we've provided a facility to bring those assessments directly in here. So as an example, looking at an infrastructure penetration test. So in here again, fully workflowed, so we can see exactly where we are across that assessment. We've got information around the test. We've got the assessment type, which again, internal audits, risk assessments, gap assessments. You can add to these, of course, if you have different type of assessments you want to track. Assessment status is in progress because it's running through the workflow at the moment. I've got who the person is that's looking after it. I've got the date the report came out. I've got links to the report as well, so I can go straight out to that report anytime I want. You know, was it run internally or externally? All the relevant information I need to keep. I can see the remediation status is closed at this point, and we had one finding that's been closed off. So this is basically ready to close off as an assessment. But I can go in and I can have a look at what findings we had. So I can see we had one finding out of this penetration testing report, and the finding I've got lots of information around. So it's tied to the assessment. We've also got it tied back to a risk as well. So we talked about risks before and tying findings to those. I've got references from the report, so I can easily go back to the original report and see where they came from. And I've got all my standard finding and remediation tasks within those findings. And then if there's any notes, I can actually keep any notes around that as well. So we got lots of visibility, and then you can create dashboards and charts and anything you want for different types of assessments. So you can actually have visibility straight away on what's open and what's not open. Next, we have supplier management, and this allows you to manage that third-party supplier risk. So keeping information on each supplier around their materiality of the business, understanding what data they have access to, what assets they have access to, what the actual classification level of information that they should be allowed to access or are accessing. You can track data sovereignty, any risk ratings across that supplier, and any risks you've identified by doing third-party risk assessments can be tied in here. You can tie those assessments in there, and you can actually perform third-party assessments in there. We have built-in questionnaires that can be followed. And all of these tie back to compliance requirements as well, to make sure that you're actually managing your third-party risk requirements in ISO or APRA or any other standard that you're following. Starting with our supplier management dashboard, I've got a lot of information around my suppliers, active reviews, questionnaires that are out there. So I've got some good visibility here. I can see that I've currently got one open finding with one supplier. I've got one supplier review currently running. I've got a supplier questionnaire that's been closed off, another one in progress, and I've got information around different tier levels and locations and industries and things like that. And again, these are all configurable based on the types of information you want to work with. Now, if I go down to my suppliers, as in the past, we've got a view of what our active suppliers are at this point, and I've got other drop downs so I can see any decommissioned suppliers, which I don't have any in this system. And for those doing PCI DSS, you've got to keep track of PCI DSS in-scope suppliers, so this is automatically tracked as well. So if I drill into one of my pretend suppliers, we've got the supplier information here, we've got their industry, their location, their primary domain, so we can look things up. We've got our primary contact linked to an internal resource. We've got our primary contact at the supplier as well. We can mark them as a material provider. We can flag if they've got access to PIA. We can flag if they've got access to cardholder data, and this is what's used to generate that in-scope PCI DSS supplier view. We've got their tiers, data classifications that they have access to, and also the types of data. So back on the asset register, we saw that you can actually track different types of information which is in those assets, and this gives you a bit more across the supplier because they may be across multiple different types of assets, so it's easy to see what sort of level they're at. We have the ability to track different types of documentation. So if they have certain certifications, we can track them here. And then we can link out to those certifications, the relevant information. So we've got that information. So if auditors come in and they go, how do you know they're ISO certified? We can go and have a look at that. Links to their privacy policy, any sort of contracts, any other relevant documents that you want to keep track of here. We can link out to SharePoint or Confluence or any other document management system you're using. Now, of course, suppliers generally need to have reviews performed. So you can actually run those reviews in here. So we can mark review frequency. So, a low-level supplier might not need one. They may be a one-off, or we may need to do them on a regular basis based on the criticality of that supplier and what they have access to. So if I go and have a look at the supplier review record, I've got lots of relevant information in here for tracking the review. So who the reviewer is, link to the supplier, of course, linking out to related documentations. If there are any findings out of this review, what's the remediation status of those findings and when we plan to have those fixed by. You've also got review notes in here. We use this a lot when we're doing reviews for our clients, is we keep all relevant information around the review in here. So it's much easier to see. We have questionnaires, and you can run questionnaires from within here, and these can be sent out to your supplier if you need to and re-imported. So you can mark it as a built-in questionnaire, and then you've got these questionnaires that you can run through with the supplier. Or if you're using your own external questionnaire or another platform, you can mark it as an external process document and then link to that actual questionnaire. So again, you've got easy access to it. Any assessments you've done. So we talked about the assessment piece a minute ago. So if you're doing any sort of supplier risk assessments, you can actually link to the assessment here. So you've got that. And any findings that come out of the review. So we've got one finding here, which of course we can track like we track any other finding with remediation tasks and other components, and we can keep track of all of that. And one of the biggest additions that we've had is our task management system. And the reason we put this in is it's difficult for people to manage all the tasks, especially in compliance standards over time. So we now have a task management system that you can tie tasks to specific people. As an example, for ISO, you have a whole list of tasks you have to do over the year. Some have to be done on a monthly basis, some on a quarterly, some on a yearly basis. We've included all of those tasks already in MRP. Same for PCI, same for APRA, same for Essential 8. So you've got all those tasks that need to be done. So you're never going to miss a task again. You can go through, assign those to people. They're repeat tasks. So once you've completed one, it repeats on the next frequency so you don't miss it. But we've also gone one step further, is we've linked all of those tasks to various compliance requirements. So taking that vulnerability scanning requirement, we have a task in there for performing internal vulnerability scans on a monthly basis. And if that's a requirement across Essential 8, if it's a requirement across ISO, if it's a requirement across PCI DSS, that task is tied into all three of them. So once you complete that task, you've crossed it off on those three different compliance standards. So when the various auditors come in to see if you've actually done the work, your PCI QSA can come in and have a look at it and go, yep, they've done all these tasks on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis or whatever the frequency is. When your ISO auditor comes in, they can look at it and go, yeah, it's all been done. So everything's there and you reduce that duplication. We've got fields in there where you can specify notification frequencies as well. So for instance, you can have the owner of a task notified over email 2 weeks before the task is due as a reminder. They get an email with the information on when it's due, and it also has a hyperlink within your email where you click on it and it takes you straight into that task record within MRP, so everything's very, very quick. And here we have the task management system. When you go to tasks on the left-hand side, it starts out with your open tasks. So any tasks that have been assigned to you will be listed here. We also have a dashboard for task management. So again, I can see what my open tasks are. I can see the tasks due in the next 30 days. And I can also see tasks by their due date. So I can see that I've got 2 due in May and I've got 3 due in June. So it's great for resource planning. And again, I can drill into these and I can have a look at the tasks that are due. I can see I've got 2 in May. And if I click on June, I've got these 3 due. So I can start to do my resource planning and work out exactly what I need to do. We've got a number of drop downs here, so I can actually go and have a look at open tasks across the entire business as well. So we've got a lot of tasks here. One of the great things we've done within our task management system is for compliance requirements. Anyone who's managed compliant requirements and all the tasks involved knows that it's a lot to manage, and it's easy for them to slip through the cracks. So what we've done is we've actually included all of the tasks required for CPS 234 Essential A, 27001 and PCI DSS. So out of the box, you can start tracking these tasks, assigning them to people and making sure they get done. So I can go into here and I can go and have a look and see if I'm doing CPS 234, what are the tasks I need to complete for the year? And I can see there's 23 tasks in here that have to be run. And I can assign these to people, set dates, and we'll talk about recurring tasks and notifications and everything in a second. If I'm doing Essential 8, I can see that I have a number of tasks that needs to be complete. If I'm doing ISO certification, I've got 26 tasks that have to be completed. And it's great for auditing time because your auditors can come in and have a look and see that you've actually been doing all these things. And again, same for PCI DSS. Your PCI QSA is going to have a look and make sure that you've actually been doing everything throughout the year, so it's easy to go in here. So if I go back to my open tasks and I go and have a look at, let's say, internal vulnerability scanning, I can see this has been assigned to me. I have a due date of the 30th of June. It's a repeating task, and my repeat frequency is quarterly, but I can set that to whatever I like. And again, if there's some sort of frequency you want that isn't in here, you can add it. I've got it attached to a related record, so I've actually attached it to my vulnerability scanning control, so everything is tracked within there. And I've also set a due date reminder, so 2 weeks before it's due. So 2 weeks before it's due, I will actually get an email that tells me that in 2 weeks' time, I need to do internal vulnerability scanning, and it gives me a link so I can come straight back into this task. I've got relevant information around this task as well, and I can link documents and keep my completed date when it's done in here. So I've got it for auditing. Now, the strength behind this is how we tied it to compliance standards. And if I go to the compliance tab, I can see that I've got vulnerability scanning needs to be done across these different areas of the compliance requirements that we have in MRP. And this means if I have vulnerability scanning that needs to be completed to comply with these 4 different standards, I've only got to do it once, and it's marked off and it's tracked and it's there. So as I mentioned before, when my ISO auditor comes in, they can see that it's been done. When my QSA comes in, I can see I've done it for PCI DSS. There's no duplication. I don't have to track it 4 different times across 4 standards. I don't have to perform it 4 different times. I don't have to do things 4 times. I just do it once and it's completed. And when that auditor is coming in and having a look at the vulnerability control to see if it's actually been done, they can go in here and they can have a look at the tasks that have been completed. I can see that I've been doing internal vulnerability scanning every quarter. So I can click on here, I can see it was done, who it was done by, any related documentation. I can click on this link and I can go to my linked vulnerability scan. So it's very quick for auditors to make sure that you've been doing what you said you would be doing. So for those of you who don't have any actual compliance requirements, like you don't have to comply with PCI, you don't have to comply with ISO, you can still use this very, very effectively to mature your cybersecurity stance. So MRP was originally built on 40 control objectives. These are built off best practices across all the different standards. And each of these, like compliance standards, are actually mapped back to controls. So they provide best practice for key risk areas. So if you're doing development internally or even using third-party suppliers, there's specific control objectives around managing secure development. And the good thing is all these controls, because they're also mapped back to compliance standards, if at some point you find that now you need to comply with a certain standard, all you've got to do is go to that standard and have a look, and you can see how you comply against it, because you've already been implementing controls as part of best practice for various risk areas of the business. And you can basically instantly get a gap assessment across any compliance standard. So you don't need to go out to a consultancy and ask for a gap assessment. You know exactly where you are. We've got clients that have been doing this, and they've got to a point where they've implemented controls, they're managing their risks, and they've gone and had a look at their ISO 27001 dashboard and gone, oh, we're actually 80% there. So maybe we put in that bit of extra effort and get to the other 100% and get certified. And looking at our control objectives, I mentioned that we had 40 base control objectives, which is what we built MRP on. So you can see these here. And these are based on objectives to satisfy or reduce various risk categories. So taking my vulnerability assessment examples we've been using, there's a control objective around vulnerability and patch management. So if I drill into here, I can see that I've got information, and I've got information around what we are trying to achieve, and of course the risk category that we're trying to address. And linked to this are various controls. So best practice leveraging different standards is if I want to do vulnerability and patch management well, I need to put these 7 different controls in place to have an information asset register so I know what I'm protecting. I need roles and responsibilities. I need a patch and vulnerability management policy. I should be doing things like penetration tests. I want to make sure that these sort of things, especially around patch management and vulnerability management, are addressed in my third-party supplier contracts, and I want to do vulnerability scanning. So if I start putting all of these different controls in place as part of best practice, I'm going to be really strong in this area. And if later on down the path I want to go and have a look at different compliance standards, I can go and see where, if I need to do PCI DSS, I can see that I'm already addressing these different areas in PCI. If I want to get ISO certified, I can see that I'm already addressing Annex A 8.8. So I've already got those. And then I can go back to that dashboard we looked at before and give myself a gap assessment and see how I'm complying with those standards. So even if you don't have specific compliance requirements at this time, you can use MRP to focus on different areas. If I go back to my risk management dashboard and I start looking at risk categories, I can start having a look at, where my risks are and what I should be focusing on. And then I can use those control objective areas to focus on reducing risks in those areas. So I'm maturing my security even though I don't have specific compliance requirements at this time. So we've only scratched the surface on what Mr. P can do. One of the last things that I want to talk about is, and one of the questions that we always get at the end of when we do these demonstrations with our clients is, how do I get access to Mr. P? There's 2 ways you can get access to Mr. P. The first I mentioned, we developed this to support our managed services. So if that's something that interests you, reach out because we include it free within our managed services. Because the whole idea was we needed a way to deliver those services more effectively. The second way is directly from Microsoft's AppSource marketplace. So you can go there right now. You can take it for a test drive because we actually have a demo system set up. So what you've seen today, you can actually go in there and try it out. And it's easy through the AppSource marketplace. You can go and buy there. You've got package security, so you don't have to worry about downloading malware infected software from a site because it all goes through Microsoft. You've got centralized billing, so you're not paying us directly. If you purchase a license, it goes straight onto your Microsoft billing, and easy implementation. It's a few clicks to get it installed. One thing we want to talk about is a licensing model. Because Microsoft only allows per user licensing for Power Apps, what we've done is to make it a fixed price for everyone, no matter what size organization, is to set it to 1,000 users. So we figured that there's probably very few companies out there that are going to need 1,000 users accessing their GRC systems. So we've set that as the point, and that way we've got a fixed price for all of our users. We don't want to go down the path of charging per user for larger organizations. We don't want to charge per module or functionality. We're not charging anything additional as we put in new compliance standards. It's just the one fixed price. The other thing is, because it sits in your Microsoft tenancy, you can actually run multiple versions of it. If you want to run up a test environment or a dev environment, you can actually install it there and make changes and do things, because I said it's a pretty open platform and you can actually make changes. What we've done is we've tried to make it as customizable as possible, so you can add and do what you need to do. You can add your own automations, you can add fields, you can take out fields, you can add your dashboards, you can do whatever you need to do. And to support not-for-profits across the world, if you are a not-for-profit and you're interested in Mr. P, reach out to us directly because we can do some additional pricing around there, also for educational facilities. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing Mr. P. So definitely the links down below. Take a look because you can go try it out for yourself, and there'll be a lot more videos coming out. So please subscribe to the channel. Thank you.